Arizona straight to the line. There's the snap to Murray. Murray looks left, pumps once, looking. A lot of time. Now he throws, and it's intercepted by the Lions. Picked off down the left sideline. Oruwariye picks up a block at the 30, 25, 20, Amani 10, 5, and he's spun out of bounds right there. I see you, 24. I see you.
Welcome to another episode of Twentyman in the Huddle, presented by Microsoft. And I have a special guest today. I am with Kevin Clark, who is a senior NFL writer for The Ringer. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
And I want to start with the profile you did on Dan Campbell last year. You were here for camp, and it was the Dan Campbell experience comes to Detroit. If you guys haven't read it, it was a terrific profile done by Kevin, so make sure you check that out on The Ringer. But what were your impressions of Dan coming away from spending some time with him last year?
It was interesting because I thought that Dan Campbell got a bad rap last year. Going into training camp, coming off of his introductory press conference, it kind of became a meme in a way that I think that, I talked to players not in Detroit, not in this building, but elsewhere, and maybe retired guys, and they were saying he was not looking at the media for that kneecap stuff. He was not looking to placate anything other than the players and the fan base, and he did that.
Right.
And I think that got a little bit lost in translation with the national media, some of the radio guys who are always going to poke fun at everything. So what I wanted to do was get to know what's this guy all about, why does he say some of the things he does say, and my suspicion was correct. He's trying to cut through to the fans and the players. He does that. The players love him. They loved him throughout that last season. They were building something. I just talked to Brad Holmes. He said that last year it wasn't the chandelier year, it was the HVAC year.
Yeah,
which
that's
I thought
good.
It was a funny way to put it. You can read that quote on theringer.com in a couple
Here
days.
it is. It's coming next.
But I just think that they're building something. That's all you can ask for after a year like last year is everything's rolling in the right direction. And there are no guarantees in rebuilds. And I've been in places where I've said, this is going exactly to plan, and then 2 years later it didn't get to where we thought it would get. But right now, all of the pieces are in place for a really, really good rebuild.
And I think it's interesting, and to your point, is they obviously started slow, right? They're rebuilding everything. You start 0-11. And then, to me, what was impressive is how that team stayed together, how that team played hard, how that team progressed. You saw young players not making the same mistakes. And then at the end of the year, they start to play their best football. And most of the times, that's when you cash it in, right? You're 0-10. The playoffs are gone. It's dog days. Your body's hurting. But they kept playing for this head coach. And to me, that was a really telling sign of, to your point, what he means to these players.
I've been in some real bad locker rooms. You have too. In November and December, and it's 2-8 teams, and you can feel it. These guys are ready for, as they say in the NBA, 1-2 Cancun, right?
Yeah.
And they're ready. And that a team that starts winning games at the end of the year when they didn't win in the beginning, that only shows you that there's buy-in. And listen, you can't say last year was success by any means.
Right.
But what you can say is if you're getting better over the course of the season, that's all you can ask for. And that they did not have high expectations last year, but I think you just culture is kind of separated from winning. I would say when you're building a culture, you don't necessarily need to win games.
That's a good point.
But winning is a sign that culture is being built. And
100%.
so that, I think, is the most important thing. And to win games in the second half of a season after an OC change, things could have gotten real bad, and I don't think they did. And that shows you, I wouldn't even give it all to Dan or Brad or whomever, shows you the locker room. Because the locker room, everything stems from the locker room. And I'm sure Dan would say this too, is that when there's a problem, it stems from the locker room. When there's a cohesive group, it stems from the locker room. Whatever it is, it's the group of guys you assemble. That's where it starts. A coach can't instill a culture by himself.
And the interesting part about that is this is such a young football team.
Yeah.
There is one player, Michael Brockers, who's over 29 years old on this roster. And so to have that kind of stability, to have that kind of accountability in the locker room from such a young squad, I think that's an important part of this whole equation as well.
Yeah, and it comes, and you see that in the draft with a guy like in Hutchinson with Jamison Williams. You're bringing in a certain type of guy who's played at the highest level in college, who's won, who's been a team leader. I saw Jamison Williams play in the national championship game. I was in Indianapolis before his injury, obviously, which was hugely disappointing. But you're bringing in guys who fit that, and I think that there are probably guys who they could have brought in and said, we're just going to stack the 53 most talented guys, but that's not really what they're interested in here.
Right.
And talking to Dan last year and talking to Brad today, it's a very deliberate rebuild with the type of guy they're trying to bring in.
You brought it up a couple times, and I'm interested in it too. Brad Holmes, you got a chance to talk with him after practice. I saw you guys kind of getting there.
We're both from Florida, so once two guys, he's from Tampa, I'm from Orlando.
Yeah.
Once you just start throwing out
talking
different
Florida
high schools,
stuff,
it was over.
But
we barely talked about the Lions.
When you did talk about the Lions, though, how did that conversation go? What did you think of the draft that he's had now 2 years and the roster he's starting to build? Kind of where did that conversation go? What were you curious about knowing most from Brad on where this team is headed, how this rebuild's going?
Yeah, the timeline was interesting to me because I think everybody. It's funny, John Dorsey is here, and I remember talking to him when he took over Cleveland, and he said that a true rebuild takes around 3 years. Brad didn't put a timeline on it. And some of that comes down to, listen, sometimes teams are ready earlier than we thought. You think about a team like Cincinnati last year, all of a sudden you get Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow says, hey, the rebuild's over because I'm here.
Yeah.
And the only reason it wasn't maybe earlier is he gets a knee injury. He has there was some weirdness in 2019.
And Jamar Chase played a big role in that as well.
But you saw it when Joe Burrow was ready to change the culture changed. And Zach Taylor was like, hey, you want to change the culture? Sounds great. Here you go, buddy. And so I think that a lot of times we'll put timelines on things and we'll be wrong. The best rebuild I was ever, I spent a lot of time around the first year Brian Flores Dolphins, right, where they're tanking and all of a sudden they're building a culture. And I said, hey, this is something. And all of a sudden they don't hit on Tua in the same way they would have if they had gotten Justin Herbert or Joe Burrow, and things go sideways from there. So you can always get off track a little bit depending on the quarterback, depending on some of the other stuff. And I do think that Chris Greer actually did a nice job just assembling talent down in Miami, but it's not where we thought it was going to be. And so I think that the best thing the Lions are doing right now is they're not putting any expectations on saying, hey, by year 3 it's go time or whatever. And also say the quarterback position, Jared Goff got better as the season went along. And it puts them in a good position because they're not going to be desperate next year for a top 10 pick, a top 15 pick, whatever it is. Obviously they're going to have more picks than they've had in the past. So I think that there's ammo for that, but I also think that they're not going to be desperate for it. I've talked to Brandon Beane about this a lot. Speaking of rebuilds, that was one of the best ones that have been in Buffalo in years. And what was interesting to me is that they're so thankful Josh survived 2018 when they were taking the biggest dead cap charge in history. They were getting rid of basically the entire roster, a lot of the Doug Whaley signings, and they didn't want him to play. And all of a sudden he was thrown into the fire, and they said, thank God he even survived that, let alone didn't pick up bad habits and was able to thrive after that. So the idea of potentially putting a young quarterback in last instead of first is a pretty interesting approach to the rebuild because I do think, even if Jared sticks next year, whatever, 2 more years, whatever, I do think there will be eventually a young quarterback, a young draft pick. Sure. Eventually they will make a decision. I don't think it's going to be like the Colts where they're just going to just kick the can down the road and just get whichever veteran is available.
And that's really up to Jared too, and how he plays this year. This is a huge year for him. The pieces are now around him offensively, at least. That this is the big year for him.
Yeah, the huge year for him, and there's flexibility there. That's the best thing. Again, that's the best thing by not having a timeline. Is it's not like you're saying, okay, we promised ownership by year 3 we're going to be in the playoffs. You got to go out and trade for Derek Carr or whomever. It's totally different, and so they can go in so many different ways. And the fact that Jared Goff got better as the season went along, the fact that he knows what he's doing, I think helps the rebuild in ways I don't know if it gets fully appreciated yet.
Yeah. So I'm curious from an outside perspective, from a national perspective, what's the view of this 2022 Lions team? Obviously, you mentioned it. It wasn't good enough last year. 3 wins, and they're not making excuses for that. Look, this is a wins business. You define coaches and quarterbacks by wins in this league. The Lions need to win more football games. But I'm curious, we all saw Peter King's comments and kind of him being really high. There's some buzz nationally about this team. I'm just curious from your perspective, from the outside looking in, what's the thought about this 2022 Lions team?
I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on a team website, but the top bet in Vegas in July, according to the sportsbooks, was Lions to win the NFC North. I don't know if you guys saw that. Literally the top sports bet in the month of July. But there's a lot of smart people. My colleague Ben Solak, who was supposed to be here today and will be here later in camp, he's been throwing down some bets and saying, hey, you never know, because you look at this division. Minnesota's in a weird spot.
Right.
Chicago's in a weird spot. Both of those teams are starting over. And
New regimes, rebuilding.
They started with more talent than what the Lions had last year.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, when you start over, things get weird, and you say, "Hey, we want to take it in a different direction." It was funny. I was talking to Brad today, and he said, it wasn't a teardown we were trying to do. It was just we kept making decisions that seemed right, and then we looked at it and we're like, "Oh, okay, it was a teardown." And so when you have a new regime, you don't know how this is going to go. Are Minnesota and Chicago going to prioritize young players to get a look, and all of a sudden they start accidentally punting on the season?
Right.
And so if there's first of all, that gives you wins in these situations. And then second of all, what happens if Green Bay stumbles? And then all of a sudden everything gets bunched up and you just never know. And so people like Warren Sharp, my colleague, people like Ben Solak, they have been high on the Lions all year. I'm not ready to make a call either way because, again, this is an open-ended rebuild, and I don't know when that turns around. I mean, I was in Cincinnati last year, and I could kind of feel something was a little different. Part of that was because I spent so much time with Joe Burrow.
When did you feel that? Was it camp? Yeah. Was it early?
No,
Did
it
you feel
was. So I got 10 minutes with Joe Burrow off the side of the field, and I just felt he's so smart and introspective, and everything seemed so calm to him in a way that I don't think young quarterbacks. It's funny because Tony Romo said this before, and I think about it all the time, where what he scouts for with a young quarterback is that the game is never too fast. If somebody sees the game slowly, they're gonna get it, even if they don't have an amazing arm talent or whatever. And with Burrow, he just sees the whole. It's not just it's his demeanor in the locker room. It's his demeanor on the field. He just understands how to run a football team in a way that I thought was interesting. And then you add that with the processing and just the way he's able to throw in practice and get guys out in routes. He takes hits because of that, because he's able to get 5 guys out into routes, and he wants that. But the toughness, and I think that what I spoke to him about this time last year was, what did you learn about yourself when he was the most famous person in America in 2019.
Right.
All of a sudden, he gets hurt in 2020. And by the way, he goes from not only playing at LSU, now he's on the Bengals, which doesn't have a huge fan base, not a lot of national buzz. Then he tears his ACL. And basically, he goes from the most famous person in the world to somebody nobody's thinking about.
Yeah.
And so we talked about that a lot, and he was so introspective, and the building blocks were there. And I thought, man, he's going to turn this around way quicker than I thought. And so it's an inexact science. Again, I was all in on the Flores Dolphins as far as rebuilds goes. It's an inexact science on when you feel it, but you can normally tell when things are going in the right direction.
Did you come away with, I don't want to say a similar, because obviously between a GM and a player, it's just different. But I'm curious, coming away from talking with Dan last year and with Brad today, did you get a similar that the Lions are on the right track with the leadership that they've established here in Detroit? And obviously, as you know, that's an important part of the equation.
I would not be writing the piece I'm writing. I would not be asking to talk to Brad about these specific things unless I felt that the building blocks were in the right place. That's the big thing for me. Is like, there are teams right now where I'm going to say, okay, you know what? Either I'm not going to go there, literally, I'm not going to get in my car and drive there, or even if I do, it's just going to go and say, hey, we're going to, I'll just meet the coordinators and spend some time with the GM.
And that was this team for a long time.
Yeah.
That's been this team for a long time.
Literally, that was this team for a long time. Hey, I just get some time with the OC.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit different now. And Dan was such the attraction. He was the box office last year, and now that shifts because if Dan Campbell's the biggest star on this team in 3 years, that's a problem. I don't think he will be, and I think that's the part of it now. And I think that it goes from kind of funny story last year to football story this year to something probably more significant after that. Again, like, until we know long term what the quarterback position is going to look like, until we see Aiden Hutchinson on the field, until we see when Jameson Williams can come back, there's still a lot of questions.
Sure.
But all I can say is that right now, things are moving in a way that most really good rebuilds do.
One other player I want to ask you about real quick, and because preparing for this pod, I was on the Ringer and I was looking at some stuff, and an article caught my attention. It was your fantasy rankings.
Oh, sure.
And I saw that you guys had DeAndre Swift at number 18 overall, which, for a guy that was a 1,000-yard guy last year, I'm just curious, from the outside perspective, obviously before the shoulder injury, she was leading all running backs in receptions last year. That's a big part of his game. Just where do you view him as kind of that two-way player in the Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara? Is he in that kind of category yet, or does he have to prove that he can be in that conversation?
Couple things. I do not make the fantasy rankings. I do
I know
not
this, but
play
I wanted to
fantasy
ask
football.
You don't play at all?
I don't play at all. Here's my thing, and I've said this a million times. It's a similar reason to why I don't bet on football either. Is that I most of my betting is on golf. Okay. And if Xander Schauffele misses a 10-foot putt at the Masters to cost me my pool, I am so mad at Xander Schauffele. I'm so mad at Xander, or whoever it may be, right? That the idea that, like, if Bobby Wagner, impacted my bank account and I had to talk to Bobby Wagner the next week, I want nothing in my brain
for sure
where I'm like, I'm so mad at you, man. I'm coming in.
You're a rare bird, right?
I want to come in blank slate on everything.
I like it. I like
everything. With Swift in particular, I'm intrigued to see pretty much everything on this offense. Swift in particular, because we know what he is, and I think that you mentioned Cook and Kamara. That's sustained excellence over a number of years, and that's also just you think about Kamara. First of all, we'll see what happens with the suspension this year, but that's a guy who's been counted out a couple times, and he's always been able to rise to the occasion. He's been paid. He's still really good, and I think he's almost underrated at this point for what he is. And so for me, I want to see this entire Lions offense come together. I mean, they're building through the lines in a way I think is really important. Once Jameson Williams is out there, it's going to be really, really fascinating to watch. But Swift is a guy just absolutely on my radar. I think the world of him. It's just you're not ready to put him in that rarefied air until it's 4 or 5 years down the line.
Well, Kevin, it was really great stuff. I appreciate you coming on. Make sure you guys go to The Ringer and get his profile on Brad Holmes, and you can read last year's profile on Dan Campbell. It was really good stuff. I expect the Brad article is going to be really, really good. I'm glad you were here in camp, and thanks for taking the time, man.
Thanks
I appreciate you. Welcome back to the Twentyman in the Huddle podcast. I am joined by a special guest here, former Michigan State University Spartan, former NFL quarterback, and current Sirius NFL radio host, Jim Miller. Welcome to the pod.
Good to be with you, Tim.
And, you've obviously got a lot of experience, not only from your playing career, but in your broadcast career. And the word that's thrown around a lot here is culture. Right, with Dan Campbell and Brad and what they're trying to build here. I'm curious your perspective. What does good culture mean? What does culture change mean to you?
Well, I think I've been on teams where, you just get a feel, at least, and normally this is the best time of year. You go through the OTAs and all that. You just get a sense of the locker room. Guys that are good, hardworking guys that love football, are dedicated to football, and things kind of just come together. Because if you get a good bunch of hardworking guys that love football, you're going to have a good team. I go back to the Bears back in 2001. I knew coming out of camp, and the Bears radio play-by-play man, Jeff Joniak, we were all in the video room with Dean Pope and all the guys that I know that have worked there for well over 30 years. And I put on an envelope. I wrote in the envelope what our record was going to be, and I put it in there. I said, don't open that envelope till the end of the season. I said, because that's what I think our record's going to be. And we went 13-3 because I told them there's a good bunch of hardworking guys.
What'd you write down the envelope?
I wrote down 13-3.
Wow, you called it, huh?
And we went 13-3.
You just sensed it then, and that's what culture is. That's kind of.
Well, you could sense it because and Dan Campbell's not wrong, and Brad Holmes isn't wrong about the buy-in factor. I think for Lions fans out there, I would feel very good about this team, and here's why. You had guys that were on this team. Everybody here in the offseason, because I live locally here in Michigan, where they're saying, well, why are they signing all these guys? They were 3-13-1. These guys lost last year. No, that's not true. You've got guys that want to be here, that want to build something. So whether it's Tracy Walker or Charles Harris or Josh Reynolds, they sense what's going on here.
Yeah.
So the buy-in factor is there, and they want a part of it. They want a part of this culture. And that's a telling answer, and it tells itself there.
And we talked about this a little bit before the camera started rolling, too, is just the makeup of this roster, too, and it being young and hungry and young vets, guys who are on one-year deals, guys who were on one-year deals last year who then earned it right? And then got paid.
Yeah.
And so it seems like it's just fun to be a part of something like that when you're building towards something with young guys who have a common kind of objective and goal.
Yeah.
And really seem to mesh.
Yeah. Well, I think it's one, it's a testament to what Brad and Dan are able to do, and that Lions ownership acknowledge that. I think they understand they're all speaking the same language, and they have a plan in place that this is not going to be a quick fix. We're going to build it correctly. And very rarely do you see a team. I mean, I hit about half the camps around the league. I've never seen a roster that you've got 40 guys that are either a rookie or a second-year player.
Yeah.
So they're building young, they're building it right, and with the right guys. And I think that's really where they're all on the same page, and they'll have the time to do it.
One guy, Michael Brockers, the only guy on this roster over 29 years old.
Yeah.
Dan Campbell, I know you sat down with him today. I know you've talked to him before, but just your impressions of Dan and where he's at in year 2 of this.
Yeah, I think, well, last year, it's like anything else. When he took over play calling, that was and he came on the air with us on Sirius. He said that was a growing experience for me.
Yeah.
It's the first time he had done it. But I don't think it should shock anybody of how they finished, because they finished strong as a team. He figured it out. The team was figuring it out. They continued to work through these things. And, you just go back in Miami when he was the interim head coach there. Honestly, they kind of messed up. They should have kept Dan as the head coach.
Yeah.
They really should have. And that was just a precursor or warm-up phase for Dan to be ready for this opportunity here in Detroit. I do think they got the right guy. And, again, Dan's a hard-nosed coach, and some guys don't respond to that type of coaching, but these players do.
Yeah.
These players do, and they want to be a part of what Dan and his style of coaching.
And you're a former player, too. Dan's not going to ask anything of these guys that he, hasn't been through before,
Right.
or hasn't been asked
They
to
trust
do
him.
himself. They trust him, right?
Yeah.
He was on that side of it, and a lot of his staff was, too,
Yeah.
right? Aaron Glenn and a lot of these guys
Sure.
were players. And so, one thing I'm really curious is when I want to flip to quarterback a little. Well, actually, let's go here. You were talking about how they played last year. When you were on teams and you saw young guys and how they developed throughout the year, the one thing I noticed last year was some of these young guys weren't making the same mistakes they were at the end of the year, right? There was tangible, visual evidence of these guys getting better. And that is a great sign of coaching to me, of guys buying in, like you said. Isn't that a great compliment to Dan, that we saw the development of some of these younger guys that really turned into guys maybe who were making mistakes early on, but by the end of the year, they had kind of figured out and were big parts of them winning going 3-2-1 in the last 6 games.
Well, I think all along you're developing young players too. Like you said, they're going to make their share of mistakes. It's only natural. But Amonra St. Brown and how he came on strong towards the end of the year, how the running game started to come together with DeAndre Swift and how well they were running the ball, because you're dealing with all these variables. No Frank Ragnow, you got guys in and out of the lineup. Penny Sewell's going from left to right. I mean, you're dealing with all these variables, but they're continuing to work. There are no excuses, and they're ascending. And I kind of relate it for Dan. Think of the first year Ron Rivera was there at Carolina. They were terrible. They were terrible, but they finished the season strong. It was the building block and laid that foundation for the following year where they started their ascension as a team. So I do think the players are responding. They're still, even with these young players, whether it's Aiden Hutchinson or the other young players that they drafted this year, there's going to be a learning curve there. But the patience is here because these guys do understand that, you made that mistake, you correct the mistake, you move on, and hopefully, like you said, you're not the moment you start having problems where players are making the same mistake, that's an issue. But they're receiving the coaching and applying it, and that's really the positive sign.
All right, we got to talk quarterbacks, obviously, with you. So Jared Goff is obviously one in this league. He's been a Pro Bowl player. He took the Rams to the Super Bowl in 2018. He's had success in this league. And obviously he started slow last year, but you saw the second half of the year. He had the sixth best passer rating the second half of the season, 11 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, passer rating over 100 when Dan Campbell took over those play calling, and Ben Johnson was elevated the pass game coordinator. The hope here is that he kind of picks up right where he left off. I'm just curious your impressions of Jared Goff and how this offense can evolve and be with him at the helm.
Yeah, I think all that again, was the foundation leading into this spring and now through the camp. They're much further along than what they were.
Yeah.
They've got all the pieces to the puzzle on offense. This is a top 5 offensive line. It's incredible. They're definitely a top 5 offensive line in the NFL. Those pieces around him are good players. And Jared has already proven he can guide a team to a Super Bowl when he has those players around him. You know, and you go back to that Super Bowl against New England, he's 2 throws away from being a world champion.
Yeah.
He was very young in his career. He was probably late. The one where I believe it was Jason McCourty reacted on and was able to bat down that pass, and then the one in the front pylon of the end zone, Jared was a little late on his throws. He's experienced now. He knows he can win. This team knows they can win with him, and he's kind of been there and done that before. And I think, again, it proves it because Brad didn't bring in anybody else, and he didn't draft anybody else. This is the year for Jared Goff, and he's had success when he's had those pieces around him. Is he the most mobile? No. Does he have the most strongest arm? No. But that's true of a lot of quarterbacks in the NFL, and you can win
Successful
Super Bowls.
quarterbacks in the NFL.
It's true, but it's about timing, rhythm, how you throw, decision making. He's tough, and they believe in him, and I think you said the proof was in the pudding towards the end of last year, and why they feel they can win with Jared Goff.
How much of an impact can it be with Ben Johnson kind of giving Jared ownership of this offense? They watched a lot of film. They kind of look back to some of the things he really liked to do with the Rams. They've implemented it here. Now, obviously, Ben's got some of the things in that he wants just to be in his offense. But how much of that is a benefit to Jared that he's kind of taken ownership and they've kind of built this thing around things that he really likes to do?
Well, it is. It's important to touch on things of what a quarterback feels comfortable with. Again, it's also important to know what he's not comfortable with. You don't want to call plays that a quarterback doesn't have confidence in. It's funny, I was just in Buffalo, and they're going through an issue with Ken Dorsey. Obviously, Brian Daboll gets the head job, and Ken Dorsey takes over as the OC, and that's what Josh said too. He goes, I feel comfortable, and he's going to emphasize the things I like, but he knows what not to call.
Yeah.
Because there are certain situations like where Jared's going to be, say it's a third and medium where a team may be on their third medium as a high blitz team. Hey, man, I do not want these plays called in that situation because you want to stay away from that because, the stuff that he's comfortable with to attack any blitz that they're bringing, you want to have a higher level of success in order to achieve it to get the first down. And that's more than anything. Jared's run pretty much every play that has been called in the NFL. And it was interesting when I was talking to him today. He's like, all right, I asked him, what do you feel you want to get better at? And for him, it's the backside checkdowns. If sometimes he said, hey, I'll hang on the front side, play a little bit too long. No, I just want to get back to my third read, check it down a little bit quicker where you can make a positive play and not really, we call it begging a play to a player to be open or a play to work out. And sometimes, hey, man, just cut your losses, move on, always make it a positive play, take the check down, and you'll live to play another down. And I think stuff like that is always great stuff to hear as a quarterback as they continue to grow. And he's 7 years in the league, and he's already been to a Super Bowl. He's been to the playoffs. And,
right.
So he knows what it takes to get there. But how do I get better so when I get there again, I'll have more success?
And the Lions are obviously very confident that Jared can take them where they want to go.
Absolutely.
The backup quarterback job here with Tim Boyle and David Blau, you've been a starter, you've been a backup. What do you look for? What's important to have in a backup quarterback?
Well, for me, like when I got in the league, I was behind Mike Tomczak and obviously Neil O'Donnell. And back then it was kind of different because you were kind of drafted in the mold. Neil was a big, strong, physical, strong-arm quarterback, and that's kind of what I was coming out of Michigan State. So they wanted the offense to stay the same, So I would look at Neil and I'd want to emulate how he called plays, how he dealt with the guys, how the coaches looked at situational play. Because if I were to ever get in a game, I didn't want those players to have something so far different, of what I do and how the offense was structured. So I had great role models, I should say, to follow. Both Neil and Mike had played a lot of football and brought me along very, very quickly in terms of how to play, what to do, how to command a huddle, all those things. And George Perlis gave me a lot of that at Michigan State, but it really was helpful having savvy veterans ahead of me. So I was very I was very groomed
Yeah.
pretty quickly with veteran guys.
No, I think that's a great point by you too, is because you don't want the offense to have to change, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to have something happens to Jared. You don't want it to dumb down your offense.
Right.
You don't want to have to change the fundamentals of what you do. Some of the plays that you
Right.
really like. I think that's important. Wouldn't you
Well,
agree?
I mean, yeah. Look at the situation in New England and why they drafted Mac Jones. But the year before, the offense under Cam Newton was far different than what they run with Mac Jones. They're just two different guys. And Bill ended up wanting to go back to more the Brady-style offense, and lo and behold, they ended up releasing in Cam, and it was just structured so much different. But when Cam was there, they geared the plays towards what we're talking about, what Cam was comfortable with, what he can, what he can't do, and I think you do that for every quarterback. But you want similarities so that the guys up front, the plays that are being called, they're not so drastically different, because ultimately you have to hang your hat on something.
Yeah.
Whether it's your run game, your play action game, your pocket game in terms of how you pass, you want it structured a certain way where there will be carryover no matter who's lining up underneath center.
All right, I got two more for you real quick, Jim. They have added some vertical threats to the outside. DJ Chark, Jamison Williams. We'll see when Jamison Williams gets back on the field. But just what does that mean for an offense? When you can stretch the field vertically, when you can make plays outside the numbers, when you have that threat, how important is that for a quarterback, for an offense to have those kind of weapons on the outside?
Yeah, it does soften up a defense. I think corners will fear the outside game with the speed that the Lions are bringing to the table, and so it's going to open up a lot of things underneath. It's going to open up Hawkinson for the stuff that he wants to do, work in the middle of the field, and he's versatile enough where you can split him out as well. The underneath stuff for Swift. So fine, you clear it out with Hawkinson and Williams, say, on two go routes, and all of a sudden Swift's coming on an angle because those guys are respecting the speed of those guys on the outside. So it is true, and it sounds cliche when you say take the top off the defense, but it's opening up things underneath where maybe you'll have those same verticals as I mentioned, then lo and behold, you've got your backside X route running a shallow cross, and you just got those clear lanes for run after the catch. And they will be feared because these are big play receivers that do have speed, and corners will be aware of it. Double move stuff, all that stuff that Goff's already very good at throwing are on the table for the Lions.
All right, I want to end with this. 3-13-1 in the first year of the Brad Dan Campbell era. Obviously, not good enough, but you knew where they were headed. They looked better at the end of the year. They were building something. I'm just curious, from your perspective, you live here locally, but you cover the league nationally, your expectations for this Lions football team in year two.
Yeah, I think they're going to be in the mix because they were in close games last year. Now, can they finish? Offensively, I think they can finish. We'll see where the pass rush comes, but those games that maybe where they lost by a field goal or 4 points, they'll be in it to win it this year. So I think expectation-wise, yeah, I think if you're looking at, say, an 8-9 season, you're making strides, or even potentially a 9-8 season, I think you'd view that as a success, because I think those close games, they'll have more grit to come out and win it over their opponents. And again, they're a young team. They're going to compete from that standpoint, and they're going to throw caution to the wind. That's what I loved about Dan last year, is that they were going for things. Those players were competing, and I just think that the messaging of the coach set up for this year. And what do I mean by that? I go to the game. What was the away game? It was in Green Bay. Granted, they went for it on a fourth down early and missed it, and that kind of backfired. But a couple players, I don't want to name the player, but he didn't give the effort that was required. And lo and behold, the next day he was up to be traded, and ultimately 2 days later the player was released by the Detroit Lions. And the messaging towards the player is, this is unacceptable. This type of effort is not going to fly here anymore.
Right.
And so I think the messaging really the players responded to it, because I think they knew what the standard was, and from then on, I think that's when the team really started to take off of what is expected and what's going to be the standard. And again, players bought into it. Players want to re-sign here, and I think it's realistic for this team to, some of those close games that they lost, I think they'll come out winners this year here in 2022.
8-9 wins. That means meaningful games in the month of December. I think that's all Lions fans can ask for, right? Playing in those meaningful games at the end, be in that playoff picture, and make it fun at the end of the year.
Yeah. A good example would be the Atlanta Falcons last year.
Yeah.
They had a veteran quarterback in Matt Ryan, but they're going younger. All right. They were in meaningful games in December. We'll see where it goes this year with Arthur Smith. They've got a new quarterback, but with Goff, you can win those meaningful games.
He is Jim Miller. That was great stuff, and we will be back for fan questions after this, Jim. Thanks so much for joining us. Great stuff.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome back to the Twentyman in the Huddle podcast. Now I am joined by PJ Clark. He is not only the producer of the 20-Minute in the Huddle podcast, but he does everything on social media, on the website, does a great job with basically everything. He's kind of one of those jack of all trades for DetroitLions.com.
I'll take that.
You take that. And he knows a little bit about football too, which is why I invite him on here. And as promised, we are going to do kind of a question and answer portion, for the second segment of this podcast. Look, PJ, we've gotten a week of practice, right? We've gotten 2 padded practices, which I love because that's where you really
That's
tell.
real football. That's as close as we're going to get at this.
What does Dan Campbell call it? The Pajama Olympics?
Yeah.
When they're out there in shorts?
Pajama party.
Pajama
That's what he
party.
used today.
The pajama party, yeah. So that's football. That's when you get to see contact and stuff like that. So that starts to tell me a lot. So, look, I posed the questions on Twitter. You collected them all, got all the good ones. And so let's just kind of rifle through these a little bit, and we'll let you guys kind of, know what you wanted to know.
So first question, Quintez Cephus went down yesterday with a leg injury after making another nice catch in one-on-ones.
Beautiful catch against Jeff.
A couple people asking for an update on him.
Okay, well, it's good. Now, it didn't look good yesterday. He was down on the field. It was a long pass down the right sideline and kind of a back shoulder type deal, and he came back and Jeff came back, and they both kind of went for the ball, and Quintez came up with it and went to the ground, and Jeff popped up and Quintez didn't. And, you're always, maybe he got his wind knocked out of him. And then he reached for that kind of left leg Peach, and it didn't look good. And he was down for a while. They had to move the drill, and he didn't put a lot of weight on that leg, and you were fearing the worst. But the update from Dan Campbell this morning was that it doesn't look serious. And that's obviously great news. I mean, you felt so bad for the kid coming out off the injury last year. He has such a great start, and then week 5, he injures his collarbone. So you're hoping it was nothing serious. He might be out a little bit while, but it looks like he has avoided serious injury, and that's great for him because he's really competing for one of those final spots at receiver. I'm curious, you've got that camera out at practice. You see some close-up stuff, and you're catching so much stuff. I'm curious what you saw from Cephus before yesterday's injury.
Much like the catch that he got hurt on, guy just makes plays. He's just out there. His ball skills at the top of a route are, I think he probably might be the best guy out here. Just at top of the route, going up, getting the ball. Not a fast guy, bigger, good blocker. This is a guy that shows up. I feel like I wanted to see him more in pads. I'm disappointed he got hurt so early. That's a guy that when the pads come on, I feel like
he excels because
better.
He's like one of those guys who does everything well, right? You talk about JMO and the top end speed, right? And you talk about Amon-Ra St. Brown, the toughness and the quickness. But with Cephus and me, like he's probably the most physical of our receivers. Yeah. Probably the best in traffic catch, pass catcher. He has some run after the catch skills. Kind of just one of those all around guys you love as
he figures
a
it
backup.
out. He does. He figures it out.
And he's productive. He is an NFL wide receiver. Yeah. I think he gets cut, he goes and catches on with another team. You need guys like that. And when they're battling now for that kind of 6th, 7th wide receiver spot, good news that Quintez Cephus is going to be back.
So he's back. Another question from Derek, more wide receiver talk.
Okay.
DJ Chark, what's the ceiling for him this year?
Ooh, that's a good.
Could he be a long-term piece, only on a 1-year deal here? Yeah. What have you seen from DJ Chark first couple days here?
The 1-year deal is interesting to me. They call it those prove-it deals. But I think if you're DJ Chark and you look at, I think a guy like Charles Harris is a great example last year, right?
Totally.
Comes here on a prove-it deal, and what does he do? He proves it, right? Leads the team with 7.5 sacks, great in the locker room, works with the young guys, has a motor that never quits, can set the edge. And then he gets rewarded for that. He gets a 2-year deal for, I think it was $13 million or something like that. He got paid on a prove-it deal. And I think guys like DJ Chark and really veterans on 1-year deals can look at that and be like, okay, if I come in and produce, Brad Holmes and this front office are good at, on their word.
Yeah.
That if I go prove it, they'll reward me. And I think DJ Chark has a chance to be one of those guys for the Detroit Lions. I think he's going to get every opportunity over there playing the X. That was a position that they really needed to upgrade. That outside the numbers gives them vertical threat. Look, he's 6'4". He runs a sub 4.4.
Yeah.
I think him and Goff have been have a pretty good rapport here early
They
in
seem,
camp.
especially early on, for guys who didn't know each other heading in this year.
Yeah.
It seems pretty good to me.
And you look at him, I think it was 2019, he's a Pro Bowler, 1,000 yards. The year after, he's a 700-yard guy on a bad offense. And then he has the injury, obviously, last year and only played in a handful of games, but was averaging over 20 yards per catch in those games he played last year. That, to me, is what he brings to this offense.
And the injury is why you can get a guy like that on a one-year contract.
100%. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point by you, because you're right. If he doesn't have the injury, if he has 1,000-yard season or close to, he's a long-term deal.
Long-term deal.
It could be here or somebody else.
Still in Jacksonville. Why would you let that guy kind of leave, kind of thing?
100%. So, I think he's a great addition. I think he's a very undervalued addition, like nationally, for this team. I think he's going to be a big part of this offense. And when you talk about a ceiling, I think he's got a great chance to be a 1,000-yard receiver here with eight touchdowns. And I think if he gets that kind of production, boy, this offense is a whole lot better.
Yeah. So a couple people asked another veteran on a one-year deal, Mike Hughes. We got a couple questions about him.
Yeah.
Hasn't been talked about a whole lot during practices, but where's he at on the cornerback depth chart?
A good veteran guy, and some guys were asking me on Twitter, hey, is he got a chance to compete with Jeff or Will Harris or something like that? He's almost exclusively been inside. Now, I know he played more inside and he started his career in Minnesota. He played outside in Kansas City, and that's the great thing about Mike, is that he's got the ability to do both. But at least early this first week of camp, he's played more in the nickel, and I think that's going to be a great competition between him and second-year cornerback A.J. Parker. Yeah. Mike's a little bit bigger, has a little bit more size. A.J., I think, a little bit more quickness, but we saw even in the offseason training program, Mike stepped in front of a Tim Boyle pass, and the instincts to kind of know where to be, having played there for a long time, and brought it to the house. So he's going to be inside, and he is very much in the mix for that nickel spot. He can jump outside, and that's a great thing to have. You cross train those guys if you have injuries, and he needs to flip outside. He's got that experience of doing it, but I think they see him right now as a nickel, and it's between him and A.J. Parker for that starting spot.
Yeah, so another guy, we got a lot of questions about this guy.
Okay.
So we got a couple Mike Hughes, a couple of Cephus updates. Malcolm Rodriguez has
boy.
been the talk of Twitter.
He's been the talk. He has.
So far. So early indications on where he's at linebacker-wise. What has he shown you? This question here from Becky Jane, is he building a fan base like he built at Oklahoma State? They love him there. So where is Malcolm for you?
I think by the end of the preseason, he is going to have a pretty nice fan base here. Because to me, and I do observations every day in practice, so I've got my notebook, right? And it just seems like every day I'm writing number 44 down for making some kind of play. And look, he's a 6th-round draft pick. He's undersized. But to me, what has stood out, and especially in the padded practice, was the instincts. This is a more aggressive defense now, as you know. They've changed from a 3-4 react to a 4-3 kind of aggressive play on the heels, see it and go destroy it. And I think that really fits Malcolm Rodriguez. When you watched his college tape and then it's translated to here, I was watching really close in the first padded practice, and it's, he sees it one step and he goes.
I mean, he blew up a screen the other day. We tweeted out the clip. Absolutely blew up a screen.
Screen. Met Greg Reynolds in the hole, and there was a loud pop there. It's just he's very decisive in his movements, if that makes sense. And I think because he's undersized, he has to be that. You
have to know where you're going.
You got to know where you're going and be able to get there quick. You have to beat those guards and centers to that spot because you don't have the size necessarily to hit them off or fight them off. And now that's technique in hands, and he's being learned being taught all that stuff. Yeah. But the instincts, to me, he's always in the right hole. He sees a screen or a play in the flat, and he identifies it so quick. He's just one of those guys, Peach, that's always around the football. And when I talk about a linebacker and what I want in a linebacker. You can talk about size and speed and the ability to rush and play multiple spots. Give me a guy who just knows how to be around the ball.
Nose for the ball.
That's what I want, and that's what Malcolm Rodriguez is. I'm really excited for fans to see this guy in the preseason. He's going to be a stud on special teams, but he is very quickly working his way into some first-team reps and some important second-team reps as well. And I think by the end of training camp, he is very much going to be in the mix. He's kind of one of those guys that I think has really stood out among the young guys early on.
So there you go. You can keep an eye on that rookie. Question from Brandon about the biggest rookie, Aiden Hutchinson.
Yeah.
Comparing to a young Ndamukong Suh, Ziggy Ansah, their first camps, being around those guys. You've been here a while.
Yeah.
Any comparison to two other highly drafted guys?
Highly productive guys, Pro Bowl guys early in their career. I think Aiden's a little bit different because with Suh, he was strictly an interior guy. And look, Ndamukong Suh, when he came in here, a number 2 pick like Aiden Hutchinson, was a dominant guy. Yeah. But I think his domination was more power. He was just physically stronger than anyone across the way from him. And that was his edge. When you talked about Ziggy, it was that size and length on the edge. They were in Jim Schwartz's defense, he was on the 9-tech. So, he was way out wide. Using his length and his speed, I think, was where he really excelled. I think the one thing that you guys are going to love about Aiden Hutchinson, and I'll use yesterday's practice as an example, is he's out on the edge, and he blows up a play, disrupts it, and has a sack on the edge. Well, then they move him inside to the 3-tech, and he does the same thing, gets by the guard, and,
he was matched up. He was moving
sack.
back and forth on both sides. I saw him matched up with Jonah and Big V out at practice yesterday.
And that, to me, is where he's a little bit different than Ndamukong and Ziggy, because he's so versatile. He can literally play all 4 positions on that defensive line, and he's one of those guys that I don't think you're going to take out a lot because you want that NASCAR package, right, where you put maybe Julian and Charles on the outside, but you want to have some rush from in the interior, so you can put Aiden or Levi or Josh when he gets back on the interior. And you just have so many options with him. And I'll tell you what, he's been impressive. He comes to work. He puts his head down. He doesn't say much. He's attached onto the veterans. Apparently, he can sing a pretty darn good Billie Jean.
Yeah, that's
Michael
a Hard
Jackson
Knocks
thing.
clip.
That's going to be wait till August 9th. We hope to see that on Hard Knocks. But he's been everything the Lions hoped he would be. And Aaron Glenn, the defensive coordinator, said even more when we talked to him last week. So that's all you can ask of the young man. We'll see how this thing progresses. But he's going to be a big part of what the Lions do, both from an edge perspective and an interior perspective. And look, they were 30th, they had 30 sacks last year, right? Or ranked 30th in sacks last year, the second fewest, pass rush win rate. So it's just they need some juice there, and early indications are that Aiden's going to help provide that.
Which is good. We've covered a lot of defense. Now transitioning over to the offense. A lot of talk about how Ben Johnson and Jared Goff kind of tailored this offense now to the Rams. So people are asking for an update on that. How has Goff seemed early on? How has the offense seeed a little bit different than what the Lions ran last year?
I think Jared's got a really good grasp of the offense. And what I mean by that is when I watch that, what that means to me is, is he checking things early? Is he handling coverages? And I think he's doing that really early in the process. Like, they're breaking the huddle, and they've implemented some tempo to this, right? So they want to break huddles, get up to the line, let Jared scan. But it doesn't take long for Jared to kind of see what's happening, make a check, get the coverages right, and then now you still have time to motion and do some of the other stuff, and you're not rushed. And I think that was maybe a little bit different last year. Everything was so new to Jared. I mean, he didn't even know where the bathrooms were in the facility. I mean, it's just you have to learn all that kind of stuff, and you're in a whole new environment. And I think now that all that's past him, you mentioned the fact that he's taken kind of ownership of this offense. Him and Ben Johnson, sat together and, kind of looked at what he did well, what he likes, and they implemented it here. And I think you can see that there's a comfort level. And I think when all that stuff kind of falls into place and you can just play fast and see the field, he's delivering the football on time at the right spots, finding the open guys. It's not a struggle and he's holding it too long and then you've got sacks. It's just been pretty crisp to me, and that's been the biggest difference. And he's finally got pieces around him, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you've seen it, and that's the biggest thing.
Something else I've noticed, just even compared to last year, early on in training camp, he's letting it fly a little bit more.
Yeah.
Going deep.
No, I would
especially
agree with
to the
that.
sideline, to
Yeah.
the outside the numbers. He's seems more comfortable to me.
100%, and that was one of the big things last year, right? The dink and dunk, and how they weren't vertical, and it just restricted what they did offensively. I think that's a great point by you, because I've noticed that as well. And he's got weapons like Josh Reynolds, which he didn't have in camp. DJ Chark, we already talked about. Wait till they get JMO back. But I think that's a good point, because you are seeing that, and now that opens things up for Hutch on the inside, and Amon-Ra St. Brown, and we're seeing those guys making a lot of plays because of what's going on outside. I mean, I think just collectively, Jared's got a really good handle on this offense, and it's looked good the first week.
And then the follow-up to this question, second part, another
They're fitting
player.
who's fitting two in here?
Two in here. We
Okay.
got Loophole Lennon.
All right, loophole.
two
You're
in.
gonna get two in today.
A lot of people are asking about Khalil Pimpleton,
Khalil
the
Pimpleton,
UDFA
yeah.
receiver from Central Michigan.
You know, it's tough because that room is so loaded, right? We're talking about Quintez Cephus and Trinity Benson, guys who've been in the league doing it as like your 6th and 7th guys. So, you know, where does an undrafted guy from Central Michigan University fit into the mix? Well, I think the one thing where he stands out to me is speed-wise. He was in one-on-ones the other day.
He's just burning people out there.
He's burning people. I mean, he has speed to burn. Undersized, right? But a perfect kind of slot vertical guy. I think where he's going to run into a little bit of problem is he's got a similar skill set to Khalif Raymond.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, obviously what Khalif does as a punt returner on special teams and, you know, the leadership, you know, from being a vet guy, that's going to be hard for Pimpleton to overcome, but he is returning punts as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's him, St. Brown, and Pimpleton back there pretty almost exclusively the first week of camp. And so, look, that young man's going to get an opportunity to
Preseason, I'm excited for live reps.
He's going to be able to get an opportunity in the preseason to play the slot and return kicks. And look, if you make plays, it's hard to cut guys like that. You know, you go and return a punt for a touchdown, or you have a really big special teams game, and then you show consistency over the middle and making guys miss and catch the footballs. That's how you make football teams.
To that point, I think that's something we saw last year with Craig Reynolds. Had a really good preseason and scored that touchdown against the Bills where he broke it around outside, dove for the pylon, and that's a guy that, you know, ended up sticking around for the whole year.
And I think at the very least, I mean, he to me would be one of those guys that would be a total practice squad type guy, a development guy that, hey, something happens to Khalil, or excuse me, not Khalil, something happens to Khalif. Boom, you've got a guy that can step in and almost seamlessly fit in there. Or you suffer some injuries at wide receiver, or, you know, maybe a couple of your vertical guys with speed go down and you want to, you know, kind of infuse his speed, because, boy, he does have it. Quickness and speed are his game. So, you know, it'll be interesting. We've got to see, because I think he's got a tough road ahead, just where the lines are at receiver. But I like the skill set. I like the player. I love the speed. And if he shows out in the preseason, he's going to make an argument for himself, and that's all you can ask as a young undrafted player.
I feel like a guy with that skill set, is where the league is kind of like trending more gadgety and getting that guy the ball. And it's just like it's a unique skill set. Even though the Lions have two of those guys, in Khalif Raymond and him, I think he's been really impressive in one-on-ones.
The only issue with smaller guys, to me, is the catch radius.
Yeah.
That's the only issue. You know, quarterbacks love those 6'4" guys
Josh
with long
Reynolds.
arms.
That's
Josh
the
Reynolds, right?
answer.
You don't have to be perfect all the time, because they can jump up and get it, or they've got that catch radius. That's the only issue with the smaller guys is you've got to be a little bit better throwing them the football, especially down the field deep. There's a little bit less room for error. So I think those guys have to particularly stand out, because they don't have the size combination that obviously, you know, teams love and quarterbacks love and offenses love. But if you make plays, and they'll find ways to get you the football.
Yeah. So going off of that, another two more undrafted guys, Kevin Jarvis, Obina Eze. People asking about them.
Yeah.
Offensive line depth.
Yeah.
How's it looking? Second team offensive line. Obviously, Evan Brown came back, started a lot of games last year, but what's kind of building around him there?
Two guys that are getting some pretty good second team reps. And I think Jarvis has even maybe fit in a couple times when they've used guys on the first team, shifted around and early on. And look, that's a great thing about this offensive line. We talk all the time about the five guys, right? You've got Dak, Big V, Jonah Jackson, Frank, and Penei Sewell, and that's your 5, and that's a great starting 5. That could be top 5 in the league. But after that, you've got Evan Brown, who was a guy who stepped in for Frank and played the last 13 games last year and was pretty darn good. I think top 10 in terms of all the analytics and the metrics from PFF and all the other places. I mean, he just really kind of stepped in there. He wasn't Frank, obviously, but he was very, very good. Then you've got a guy like Matt Nelson, a former defensive tackle who can who's now an offensive tackle. He was your swing guy last year, but when Taylor goes down, right, they move Penei to left and Nelson steps in at right. And was it perfect? No, but I think he was very, very solid there. And now he's a year older. Tommy Kramer, undrafted guy from Notre Dame, got a chance to play with some injuries
last year
and was really, really good. And so, now you're talking about 2 more guys that are in that mix. And so to me, that's like we talked about with receiver, that's really a stacked room. I think they've got to feel really good about what they have, not only with their starting 5, but with the backup and the competition that's developing with the 2 guys that you just mentioned there, along with the other ones I talked about. And, you can throw Logan Stenberg in there too. I mean, they've got guys. I think that's going to be a hard decision in the end, and that's a good thing to have. That's what you want. That's when you know your football team is better, when you're cutting guys that are probably going to be picked up somewhere, or it's a really hard decision.
Yeah, so we got one more question, and then I want to get to a kind of a training camp first couple weeks wrap up.
Okay.
But one more Twitter question from Ashley David Soden.
All right, Ashley.
Training camp. Special teams battles.
Okay.
People are asking, who is going to make the team based on their special teams contributions. It's kind of hard now in training camp to just get a judge of that, but what have you seen from the training camp period so far?
Well, I think the biggest competition obviously is kicker, right, between Riley Patterson and Austin Siebert. That one will be interesting. I think they're close right now, and that's, the joint practice, the special teams, and that's going to develop, and I think, will be a decision that just comes along the
Works
final
its
week.
way out. Yeah.
I think the interesting one to me is the linebacker spot, because there's obviously question marks when we talk about the linebackers on defense, but when you look at that position from a special teams perspective, I think they've got a lot of guys there that are pretty darn good. Yeah. I mean, you looked at the Chris Board who came over, who was a special teams ace from Baltimore. Josh Woods, really good on special teams. Anthony Pittman, really good. We talked about Malcolm Rodriguez, and he's going to get those opportunities on special teams as well. And look, those guys are so important on special teams just because of their size, speed, combination, that skill set. It just fits. You can play in space. In special teams at that linebacker spot. So those guys a lot of times are your core guys. And so I think it's going to be interesting how they view, okay, this guy's great on special teams as a linebacker, but is he in our mix defensively at linebacker? And then how many guys can we have who are maybe just special teams, core guys? How many times can play, can be linebackers? Yeah. So it'll be really, really interesting kind of see what they view and how they view those linebackers in terms of special teams and defense. That, to me, is something to watch. It'll be one of the better competitions.
So then one last quick question for me. Of the people we have not talked about, and we've hit a lot here, who stood out just in pads for you so far?
Who stood out in pads to me that we haven't talked about yet? DeAndre Swift.
People are always interested in DeAndre Swift.
They're always interested in DeAndre Swift, but I tell you what, I mean, he got rocked out a little bit this offseason.
Yeah.
He's cut.
He got bigger.
For
sure.
He got bigger, and he didn't lose any speed doing it.
Yeah.
And it's just that one cut nature I love. And if those guys in front of him can stay healthy, if he can have a top 5 offensive line with his explosiveness, with what they've added on the outside, with his ability to be in space and be a big part of the passing game, I've just been impressed with how they've used him as a receiver, how he's been running. He's got a chance to me, and I don't think this is way off base, is I think he can be a 1,500-yard scrimmage guy this year and be one of those top dual threat running backs when you talk about the Alvin Kamara's and the Dalvin Cooks and all those. I think he can be in that conversation. I think he's that good. He's been impressive this first week, and it'll be exciting to see what he continues to do.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you guys for joining us. We will be back next week with some more national analysts. We might throw some questions in there. I'll be joined. I think we're going to talk a little bit NFC North. So I got a lot planned for you guys next week and the coming weeks as we finish off training camp. Thank you guys for joining.